Thank you, President von der Leyen. We hear a lot from elected officials. In fact, we've heard a lot from them this morning. But what about the citizens? What do they think about the issues? What do they think about their governments? What do they think about democracy? Well, the Democracy Perception Index tells us it has been produced for many years now in collaboration between Latana and the Alliance of Democracies. And with me here right now is Nico Jaspers, who is the CEO of Latana. So, Nico, the headline: what is the current state of democracy?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me again for the 6th year now in a row. We've been collecting this data for 6 years. And one of the most interesting questions I find that we always ask is people around the world, how important do you think democracy is for your country? And to start off this session with some good news, we have a record high across the world with 85% of people saying it is very important for our country, for my country, to be democratic. It's always been high, but we are at the highest we've ever measured. Now, beneath that, first of all, this is really spread across the world. There's not a single country where there's a majority of people saying, oh, it's actually not that important for my country to be democratic. There are some nuances, but in general, we see this really across the world, all countries that we measure. Now, if you dig a bit deeper, we also ask, how democratic do you think your country is? And there you see a bit more nuanced picture, and not just in countries what we would say the usual suspects, but some very established democracies like Japan and France, Greece, where people are a bit more skeptical. After that, we ask a battery of questions to understand aspects of democracy a bit better, freedom of speech and other things. And I want to pull out one interesting insight from this year's edition, and all this is published in a report which was really very, very interesting. We asked the question, do you think your government is acting in the interest of a majority or the minority? And the data here is interesting and very alarming. You see all those countries in red are countries where a majority of people think that the government is acting in the interest of a minority. Now, that usually means it's not acting in my interest for people. And ignore the maybe China for now, because there are different dynamics going on. But what you see here is that the Americas and almost all of Europe, with the notable exception of the Nordics and Switzerland, people say the government is acting in the interest of a minority. And this is pretty alarming, I think, because this nurtures resentment. This will show in upcoming elections. Another question, and to close off this part then, is we ask people, what do you think your government's priority should be? And every country is different, of course. We aggregate those numbers, and these are also very interesting. The absolute number one is reduce poverty, followed by number two, corruption. This is a real worry for many people across the world, second most important. And the third most important is promote economic growth. So you're starting to get a picture here of the government is acting in the interest of a minority, and please focus more on poverty, corruption, and economic growth. And this is really something to think about in all the countries that we covered, but especially in Europe and the US, I think.
What did the survey tell you about perceptions of the US and Russia and China?
Also very interesting data on this one. We started measuring this only 3 years ago, so we have 3 years now trends. Perception of global powers. We measure a bunch of global actors, global powers. The EU, which is nice for the previous speaker and maybe for the next one, has the most positive perception of the actors that we measure around the world, followed by the UN, and then with a bit distance, but still a very positive overall global view, the US. One interesting thing that happened over the past years is that the perception of China across the world has gone from a net negative to a slight net positive. So that's something notable, and we'll go into sub-trends here in a bit. But the biggest change, really, from a very low starting point, admittedly, but is a very steep rise in the perception of Russia, from very negative to less negative. But this is a very strong a dynamic that we see here. And we break this down into individual regions. And again, all this is in the report. And you can also get the raw data to then look at every country, how they perceive these actors across the 50 plus countries. What's happened for the US is that perception in Latin America is pretty stable. Perception in Asia is pretty stable. Globally, it's pretty stable, a slight decrease. But in the MENA region, it has decreased massively. And in Europe, it has also decreased substantially. Now, I should say this was before the approval of the aid budget to Ukraine, the fieldwork for this. So this might not reflect the recent weeks. But this is something that is concerning for people like us here, I think. We have China, very popular in the MENA region, very high net positive approval rating, if you will, very positive in Latin America and growing, same in Asia, same globally, very negative in Europe with a slight decrease, but pretty stable. And now comes Russia, and this is really interesting, where you have a steep, very steep rise in the MENA region, a steep rise in Asia, in Latin America, across the world, and the region where this has been a negative is Europe. So this really is something to think about, how Russia is not just perceived in Europe or the US, but across the world. And we've seen this a bit last year, and this trend has just accelerated.
So the war in Ukraine is clearly a factor here. What did you find about support for Ukraine in your survey?
Yeah, I forgot a couple of slides, but we can skip this. Sorry, Russia and Chinese are very favorable, have very favorable views of each other, and then they view the US very negative, and in Europe it's a bit more mixed. To your question on Ukraine, which is of course very topical, what we see, another one that I skipped, influence of US on democracy, support for Ukraine. Something that we've seen in the past 2 years, and that holds pretty stable, is that we ask people whether they're in favor of cutting economic ties with Russia, which is a proxy on their stance. And we had a huge kind of favor of cutting ties in North America and Europe, and against cutting ties in the rest of the world. And this really shows the split of the world on this question, which is really important. By the way, we also asked that question, since Anders mentioned China and Taiwan. For China and Taiwan, it's also in the report. Very interesting data here. So this has not changed. So despite everything that has been going on the past 2 years, the by and large, people in the US and Europe are in favor of cutting ties with Russia, except for this little green spot there that you see in Europe, Hungary, but apart from that, and Greece, but apart from that, there's a very strong support for cutting ties. Now, something that is interesting and different from previously is we also ask overall, what's your stand? Does NATO, the EU, and the US, do they do too much to support Ukraine? Do they do just about the right amount, or do they do too little? And here, very interesting, there's an overwhelming support for either keeping up the current level of support or doing more. 80% across the world overall are saying we need to keep up the support or do more, and only 20% say we should do less. Now, in Europe, very similar numbers overall. In the US, you have a growth in the numbers of people who are saying we do too much. Again, this was before the aid came out. As a German, the last chart is very concerning for me, and we need to do a lot more in Germany, I think, to explain why we need to support Ukraine. We have a massive increase in the number of people who are saying we're doing too much. Still 60% of the German population say we're doing the right amount or we need to do more. But 40% now, up from 14% 2 years ago, are saying we're doing too much. And this is something to really think about and to work on. We have a lot of work ahead of us.
And we'll see what the
Thank you.
data shows next year. Thank you, Nico Jaspers, CEO of Latana. Great to
Always.
have you with us here again to give us the
Thank you.
big picture.